I recall when, as a student, calling Nigeria from London in the late 1970s and early 1980s, one had to book a call and discuss with the Nitel operator why you had to beg for some pocket money from your parents. While some conversations are now secret, are not secret now, I beg your pardon, none were secret then. You booked the call. The Nitel operator listened to you and decided whether or not they were going to connect you, and then they would say something like, "Oh, sorry, no more money. Don't worry, it will be good." Then they'd put you through to your mom or your dad who were on the other side of the line. Now, WikiLeaks took a different form back then. Everything was leaked, I suppose, on that line. The sale of GSM licenses to a range of investors and operators, notably MTN and Celtel, has heralded a wave of changes. From basic voice, mobile operators' products have horizontally integrated into a wide range of retail, wholesale, and corporate markets, and vertically into text, data, corporate platforms, and internet-linked products. The highly successful ventures in the mobile telephony space has changed the lives of hundreds of millions of people in Africa. It has reduced the need for unnecessary journeys and spared the already creaky transportation infrastructure from unnecessary use, and has increased industrial and social productivity. The success of mobile telecoms in Africa has provided unequivocal empirical support for the view that with the right incentives, we're back to incentives, with the right incentives and reduced transaction costs, private capital could effectively deliver a range of services which government thought was its purview. So private capital can do this. Now, what about the scope for regulation? The development of these industries has not been without the challenges to social welfare. Now, I pointed out that profit is part of the social welfare. And so, without it, you can't get any form of optima. So those people who would regulate profit miss the point. Then you take away the profit incentive. Then you stop private capital. But you have to be mindful of the limits of capital, as we all see. So in what follows now, I don't want to sound like an Ida Tarbell, who's a famous lady from the United States who pursued the robber barons, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Mellon, J.P. Morgan, of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But it's interesting to note that despite the wrangling, or perhaps because of the wrangling with the US governments and the presidents of the era, for example, Harrison, Cleveland, Roosevelt, McKinley, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, in the end, the US realized that monopolies were not in the support of free markets, competition, or liberty, and some regulation was required. So while not perfect, those processes which created the Constitution of the United States continue to influence institutional mechanisms to enable and liberate markets and ensure scope for innovation and evolution of markets. And perhaps it's that American Constitution, the way it's written, the way it's designed, with its flaws, that a lot of people in the world who may be opposed to some of the things that the United States stands for need to look carefully at, to express some form of, if not gratitude, but some form of understanding for what the Constitution attempts to actually do. So in practice, the development of effective antitrust policy has continued to ensure that all cohorts of capital could be priced efficiently and that the rights of entrepreneurs were guaranteed by providing them with as level a playing field as possible. In the book, Traitor to His Own Class, J.W. Brands makes the point that Franklin Roosevelt was not just being populist when he supported the US Congress's tightening of antitrust policy. He was saving capitalists from themselves. And while also perhaps concerned with the social welfare, paradoxically, contrary to the accusations of treachery leveled against him, he was saving the class from which he came. Therefore, the development of appropriate institutions with which to regulate industry is not anathema to business. It is a necessity. Yet in Africa on a whole, such institutions are poorly resourced, easily corruptible, and in general lacking in political support, and so they are not very effective. 7 or 8 years ago, I conducted a study with some colleagues in which I used econometric methods, statistical methods, to test the relationship between institutions and financial market development in the Middle East and North Africa region. There was a debate earlier on about whether or not the North Africa is part of, for example, when I listened in earlier on today about whether or not North Africa is part of the Middle East, well, no, rather part of Africa or not. Well, North Africa is, by definition, Africa, so it's sitting on Africa. So it's a kind of redundant argument, though culturally it may be elsewhere. The availability of telecoms was one of the explanatory variables specified and tested. The estimate that we got from our results was a significant coefficient for telecoms. Now, although the focus of that study was only on financial sector development, it is interesting to see the way in which telecoms has now had an effect on society as a whole in the MENA region, in Middle East and North Africa region. Now, perhaps if the model was re-specified, now telecoms would not be the explanatory variable, it would be the dependent variable. And as we can see vividly by what has taken place in the last 6 months in the Middle East and North Africa region, new technology is indeed a Pandora's box. However, in its own way, this has been taking place in Africa. People say, well, when are we going to see the same effect in Africa? Well, I say, when we roll out more telephones and get them to everybody's hands and more people have them and we do some of the things about our institutions, some of these things will happen and it'll happen at much more rapid pace. That they happen with a lag does not mean it's not going to happen. So I say this is already taking place, but very slowly and from very low levels, so that it's not immediately visible. I believe the tide is coming, though. For some proof, go to the market women in Accra and see how they use phones. Go to the townships of South Africa and see how shebeen owners and loan sharks use phones to price loans and price beer. The advent of new technology will bring political and market changes for which business should be prepared. Africa, the last frontier, is truly opening up. The changes that will be brought as a result of technology and social media in Africa will lead some countries to crisis. However, a number will transition effectively. These will be the ones with appropriate, robust institutions and polycentric commons. Europe obviously realized this a long time ago and has been careful about polycentric commons and careful about making sure that there is a broader Europe. So with Africa on this, with Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the past is not innocent. However, it is the past. We need to look to the future. And so, to a preamble and some suggestions about what we might do about our institutions. And at this point, ladies and gentlemen, you might perhaps rightly ask, what has any of this got to do with business? But I figure that you're all either too clever or too polite to do that. Just in case, though, I'll attempt to make a number of linkages in the last few minutes then. The civil service, which has served only one government, is unlikely to be independent. If it is beholden to the government, then it is unlikely to guarantee the rights of stakeholders from constituencies outside of the ruling party, which has been the government. So even in Botswana, that much trumpeted beacon of African democracy, which it is, one could easily point to holes in the institutional framework. For example, in the time since Botswana gained independence in 1966, the US has had 9 presidents and changed political party from Democrat to Republican 6 times. Over the same time period, the United Kingdom has had 8 prime ministers with 9 governments. Harold Wilson, if you recall, served twice. So, and there have been 6 changes of government. And these changes, interestingly, have been without coups. They've been done by democratic dispensation. So no one has had to listen to some bad martial music, followed by crackled radio announcement with a brother leader saying those dreaded words, "Fellow compatriots," in collaboration with my colleagues, bloody, 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 blah, yada, 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 yada. Ching, 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 for me and my friends who've been able to push out the government. But couched differently, of course. That last sentence was never used, just fellow compatriots. So it's no wonder that despite the current lethargy in growth and continued hangover of the recent global financial crisis, and just looking at the paper this morning, expectations of growth in the UK are lower than have been revised downwards by the Bank of England. But despite that, the markets of the countries which have not recently experienced this kind of trauma, or the playing with institutions, or the denigration of institutions, and these kind of trauma, continue to be stable. So they're not doing anything exciting. Growth rates in the UK and the developed markets are not going to be exciting. They're not emerging markets. So as I say to friends, emerging markets are exciting because they are emerging. Right? And mature markets are mature, well, because they're mature, and they're not as exciting. Now, I use Botswana as Africa's best example and suggested that there are problems even with its own performance. I dare not consider some of the others, for their record is, as I pointed out, appalling. An ongoing piece of research which I've been asked to be involved in, and I'm supervising from afar, is called A Critical Review of African Politics, which has the unfortunate but perhaps adroit acronym CRAP. Now, this work attempts to relate the performance of African economies to the type and performance of their governments. The African record of democracy has been, shall we say, a critical review of African politics. Never mind some of the war zones. Côte d'Ivoire recently has joined that, and the DRC. The sad state of affairs in many Francophone continues to be, in Francophone countries, continues to be a worry. While stable, all that meets the eye is not what's there. Joining this, of course, more recently, and one has to be frank, is countries such as Uganda and Ethiopia, darlings of a number of donors and interest groups a while ago, but now also exhibiting some of the telltale signs of brother leaders. Given all the above, in the African context, what are institutions? Well, firstly, there are mechanisms to guarantee rights, including property rights, but not just property rights. There are mechanisms to provide certainty to all, impartiality in the law, and now critically, with separation and freedom of the various estates to function without hindrance. In the positivist sense, they must be connectable to cultural norms, such that they evolve. And that's the point that North was making earlier on, so that they evolve with the societies and they're owned by the societies in which they develop. And there's a linkage. So that they interact at all of the levels of government effectively. And that's that point that Elena Ostrom made about the polycentrist view. So it's not just located at the center of government, but at local government as well. And there's a linkage made there. What aren't institutions? Well, they're not individuals. They're not big men. They're not sycophantic cults to individuals. They are not institutions. Institutions are not buildings. Institutions are not unimplemented, non-transparent government processes or non-enforceable legislation. To recap, why are institutions so important to business? Well, without them, ladies and gentlemen, markets cannot function optimally, even when they provide profits. So even when you observe profits and it's a face value signal that there's a market there, that market is not performing optimally. So with practical steps, well, a number of practical steps. I think one of the first things we got to do on the continent is to subordinate national boundaries to market boundaries. Most states are not economically viable entities. Recall that in the US, apart from the aversion to slavery, etc., the Unionists resisted the US South's attempt at secession because they recognized the viability of the economies of scale of the Union, and they did not want that to be hampered. The current African map is not the original map. I'm not asking for it to be withdrawn, but it's a fallacy of the innocent past. The fact that we have this political map as exists does not mean that these are maps which markets should recognize. For example, my grandfather grew and sold tobacco in northwest Cameroon and in the early part of the 20th century. And we have family ties that cross that border from the southeast of Nigeria all the way to the northwest of Cameroon. So we have cousins and relatives and people in the northwest of Cameroon. But we are separated by a border. Now, that's not a unique position for many Africans. As to capital markets, this same issue of integration and scale. For example, we see a strong statistical relationship. Colleagues and I, 15 years ago at the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa, did some of the first work that looked at the correlation, statistical correlation between across African markets. And we noticed that there was a strong correlation between Johannesburg and London. But there's almost zero correlation until Cross Holdings started off between Johannesburg and some of the markets in its immediate vicinity. This is obviously for cultural reasons, but also for institutional reasons, because you would find that there was an institutional similarity in the quality of regulation of the Johannesburg market relative to the London market, and that similarity was stronger than that between the Johannesburg market and some of the markets which were geographically closer to Johannesburg. In 2005, and this is another aspect of the importance of integration and how institutions are important and what we need to do. In 2005, I was asked by the then Minister of Finance, the South African government, to lead a team to design a 10-year strategy for the African Development Bank. A conclusion that we arrived at was that we need to do away with national sovereignty issues that prevent optimal regional markets from emerging, as this hampers the viability of some large-scale infrastructure projects. Now, in electricity, the large dam, the Inga Dam in the DRC and the Cahora Bassa in Mozambique are good examples. Those dams can electrify all of Africa and export electricity beyond Africa. The issue of viability of states is not my view, just my view at their current scale. It's also the view of people such as Mo Ibrahim, who's argued that there's an absence of economies of scale at the current structure that we have them for African countries. This view has been written about, and is a kind of argument was put forward by Krugman that led to his getting a Nobel Prize a long time ago. The point here is that infrastructure is critical for institutional development. National boundaries are political boundaries, but are not market boundaries. Institutional norms should flow with market norms, and there's only one right way of doing things. The writer, the historian Niall Ferguson, in a book entitled High Financier, The Lives and Times of Sigmund Warburg, on page 31 of the book, refers to and quotes an article which Sigmund Warburg wrote in 1968, which I think makes this point very well. He said, Izvestia and Pravda, not Prada, but Pravda, repeat the communist doctrine that such crises are inherent in the capitalist system. This is a total fallacy. The recurrent economic crisis, just as the recurrent wars we have suffered since the beginning of this century, are the inevitable symptoms of the titanic clash between modern industrialization and technology on the one side, and the outdated 18th century political system of the sovereign nation states on the other side. This is being written in 1968, which is what makes it profound. He then goes on to say, the extraordinary evolution of science and technology and the ever-growing yearning of the masses for more consumer goods and luxuries require production facilities and sales organizations covering increasingly wider areas of the world. But we insist that the economy, which is no longer a national but a world economy, should be developed within the outdated political framework of the sovereign nation-state structure, which divides the world into smaller and smaller compartments. And that's the position in Africa. So seen in this light, and noting that it was Sigmund Warburg who more or less developed the Eurobond market and then had this view from around the late 1960s, but seen in this light, air, road, rail, water, and electricity networks in Africa are still inadequate and at the core of getting institutional development to take place. It has been said before, and while there has been some progress in these areas, in my view, it's not enough. For my view is that infrastructure is not only transporting people or turning on their lights, it's ensuring that there are linkages across and with people. And that very act itself buttresses institutions. Rail gauges, so rail gauges need to be regionally standardized, and road networks need to be linked. National airlines, in my view, are necessary, and no country needs to own one. These are all areas in which entrepreneurs should be given the opportunity to traverse the continent as one. And I'm glad to see that they are starting to do so. For example, in airlines business, Arik, the Nigerian airline, is providing services from Lagos to parts of West Africa. A low-cost airline in South Africa has started providing services to East Africa. Kulula is the name of that airline. Such entrepreneurship creates incentives for the further development of active debt markets for financing infrastructure, harmonizing infrastructure. I served on the board of the Bond Exchange of South Africa for about 6 years, and one of the things that we tried to do was to find ways to integrate debt markets across the continent, an ongoing mission. But the development of debt markets and infrastructure lies very strongly in the story of the United States in the 20th century. And the US bond market evolved, there was a strong interaction between the debt markets in the United States, transparency in the pricing of debt, transparency in information provided such that the pricing of debt was effective, the information flow mechanism to make sure that markets worked efficiently to price debt and discount debt effectively. That worked very well in developing those bond markets in the 19th century and the 20th century. And fortunes were made on this. Morgan underwrote the bonds, Mellon structured the equity, Carnegie produced the steel, and Gould and Frick ran and had major battles over the railways and fought and killed each other over them. A series of US governments played a major role in providing, throughout all of this, the institutional framework to enable robust property rights, courts, the arguments between Frick and Gould that led to deaths taking place, and the fact that the law would pursue those actors and take them through the legal process despite their wealth, and ensure that entrepreneurial risk was rewarded. What were the values that created the 19th century innovators, and how is this linked to Africa? Are they the same as those creating the innovators and innovations of the 21st century? If you recall the origins of the robber barons, the Carnegies, the Mellons, they were Scots. The Morgans were Welsh. The Warburgs were German Jews who saw early Hitler and what he was bringing and left. And they saw the atrocities of the Nazis. That skill is not a unique skill that you only find in Europe. It exists amongst Africans. A number of African entrepreneurs have the same values as the above-mentioned titans. However, the absence of polycentric institutional controls enables them not to have an appropriate or healthy institutional compact with government. Some then therefore say things like, the government is corrupt, so I will be corrupt. I don't receive any services, so I won't pay any tax. A declining balance, in my view, of social depreciation and rot then takes hold. That is not the answer. The answer is, I have paid my tax and I demand a service from government at all levels. Many people doing the same thing and saying the same thing with the same voice, as we have seen in North Africa, concentrates the mind of power. Particularly now we can see also the strength of social media in getting this voice put across. In describing some of the customs of the Lilliputians in Gulliver's Travels, though Jonathan Swift eventually went mad, but I'd quote this to you. There's a quote where he says about the Lilliputians that they look upon fraud as a greater crime than theft, and therefore seldom fail to punish it with death. For they allege that care and vigilance with a very common understanding may preserve a man's goods from thieves, but honesty has no defense against superior cunning. Of course, I'm not saying that I'm advocating death penalties for bribe givers or corrupt people. I'm not advocating that. I'm just putting that as an example of the importance of there not being a free ride for people who do corrupt things in the system and who denigrate institutions. So we need to believe in Africans. We need to ensure that rent seekers are not able to do the things that they do. And that's a big challenge. So while business needs to recognize the role of local rules and customs, there's no African way of doing business, just the correct way of doing business. If Dean Likerman was here now, he might readily attest to this view, that although African markets are still relatively shallow and less effective at providing market signals, for example, there's no African way of applying IFRS, there's just IFRS. Yeah, there's no unique thing about Africa being corrupt. Africa is not necessarily more corrupt than anywhere else. Africa is actually not very different from anywhere else because we're all human beings. It was just an issue of perception, an issue of principle, which we have to continue living with. So what we need to do is to encourage good government and oppose bad government, which is clearly great for the rent seekers, but inimical to sustainable economic growth. If you recall, the market alpha of every market reflects information on the quality of institutions, government, stability, and transparency. While the betas can always be diversified away to other markets, they cannot erase the underlying alpha from which they were derived. Thus, bad government always increases the weighted average cost of capital. And if that wasn't enough, we have to note that we need to move information to do things, so that by providing information and education to the mass of Africans, particularly women and girls, we can empower Africans. This will deepen markets and create the critical mass and economies of scale and scope and bring down the transaction costs. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a short-term agenda. It's not something which, as North pointed out, we can do overnight. Linking what we do in business and the way we live and the way our societies are now, and trying to find some path that links them back to their past and taking the benefit of that past to go forward is not a short-term agenda, but it's something that we, as Africans and as human beings, really need to do. We can't impose systems on the world. So finally, I would say the following. Maraniss, that same author who wrote about Vincent Lombardi, says, while man was blessed with intellect and free will, he was ennobled only when he sublimated individual desires to join others in pursuit of common good. Ladies and gentlemen, for my part, I read that statement to mean the following. We must do all that we can to resist the celebration of the capacity to debase the institutions of the commons in Africa, or the common understanding of the role of institutions as the shock absorbers of society. Therefore, we must be able to transmit the quality, the importance of the quality of institutions, not just to the elites in this room, and all the Africans and all the people in here are members of the elite, but we must be able to transfer this message to the people who are in villages and rural communities. Because not protecting institutions, acts that debase institutions, are nihilistic. The protection of institutions is too important to be left to government. Business must also play a role, as it's in its own self-enlightened interest to do so. The past is not innocent, ladies and gentlemen, but it is the past. Africa's future is bright. Thank you very much.
We might have time for one quick question for Dr. Okyehalam. So if anyone's got a question, someone's got a question in the back. All right, I'm going to run around with the microphone.
Thank you, Dr. Okyehalam, for the really introspective journey into Africa and the future. One of the things that most people are highlighting now about the continent is the role of higher education on the continent. And I think I've seen studies that have alluded to the fact that what's actually more important in Africa is the young generation coming up, and that's even more important than any other kind of resource that we have on the continent, and that it's going to depend on how we channel this resource that's going to decide for us what happens in the future. Do you have any perspective on that?
Thank you very much for your question. I would quickly say that that's very critical and important. Of course, education is important, but critically targeted at girls and women. I can't overemphasize that. I'll give you an example. The Taliban, for example, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, are failed from an organizational point of view, are not a very efficient organization, and I hope they don't blow up anybody or do anything, but from a social point of view are not very efficient. Anybody that excludes 50% or doesn't educate more than 50% of its market, its potential market or its potential labor force, undermines its rate of potential economic growth. So targeted education is critical, not just education, but aimed at girls, aimed at women, is critical. And that's an area in which the continent, the African continent, must place great policy, social, and business emphasis. In South Africa, we have a thing, we have an activity, let me use the right adjective, in which we have young girls come and shadow somebody at work. And it's fantastic. I mean, I look forward to it. They come to work with you or sit with you in the office for the whole day. And it's gotten so good that some of the girls that we've gotten from school come actually more than the one day, because I've taken quite a liking to the one particular girl who's so bright. And we're thinking of hiring her. The problem is that she's only 14. But she's very, very clever, you know, and I'm not, and I say that tongue in cheek, but that the point is that unless and until we recognize the importance of education, particularly for girls and women in general on the continent, we will not do the things we need to do. In fact, our institutions will not function the way that they're meant to function.
Right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Kihalom. Thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause?
I know it's been a long day for most people here to calm down, listen to different people, giving you ideas and thoughts about Africa. But I think that we've saved the best for last. The man on the screen needs no real introduction. Everyone who's been to Africa knows about mobile telephony and has heard about MTN. I'd like to present to you the former president and group CEO of the company. His career background is varied. He has a background in finance, and he's also an engineer by trade. So ladies and gentlemen, without much ado, I give to you Mr. Phuthuma Nhleko.
Okay. Well, afternoon or good evening, everybody. Let me start by saying it's really an honor for me to have been invited to come and say a few words to all the attendants today. It's really my first time at London Business School, let alone this conference, which I believe has been running for almost 10 years. I would also like to apologize in advance. Firstly, for a number of stats that I'm going to show, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of stats. And secondly, really, for not making a speech. I don't know how to make a speech. I'd really like to be more interactive and really share things with you and essentially, give you my own perspective, having been the CEO of MTN for the last decade, up until the end of March. Of course, there's nothing such as an absolute truth, and I'm sure people will have very different views on very different aspects of what I'm going to say, which we can clearly take up in the Q&A. I was asked to talk about Africa and the investment opportunities, and of course, by implication, really the perspective on how people see Africa. I thought I'd just start off with one or two images. Hopefully the slides are running. Africa, in many respects, has got or elicits very different views. Just to frame the question, that is one view that people have of the continent. That is yet a different view. Maybe very similar to the last one. That is yet another angle. Different perspective. And maybe finally, the last perspective. And of course, I can show 10 variations of this. And the essence of the point is we are actually driven by perspective. We who are in Africa and the people that are trying to invest in Africa. And if we look at some of the key drivers, those drivers will scope the opportunity that certainly we've seen in the last 10 years. At the moment, as we all know, the economy, the global economy has slowed down, even though emerging markets are still at about 6.5%. More developed or established economies, 2%, and Africa at about 4.5%. And I know some of these terms are fairly loaded. I mean, there's nothing emerging about China or Brazil as far as I'm concerned. The commercial opportunities and the risks have been enormously overstated. And this is not to say that these kind of countries do not have challenges. But I do think that it all starts with those first few slides and where in the world you're sitting and what perspective you have. Of course, there's enormous lack of infrastructure. I think Speaker a bit earlier pointed out this enormous shortage and shortfall. However, there is a very, very strong aspirational aspect. When we started in certain countries, including South Africa, we would try and get low-value handsets and say there's an issue on affordability, people cannot afford a handset for whatever the amount was then, $50 and so on. There were very low-value Chinese manufacturers and would buy those handsets. Guess what? The people to whom would want to try and subsidize by giving those handsets said they wouldn't have them. They wanted Nokia, they wanted Ericsson, they want top of the range. Okay? And this is just a simplistic